Vampire Lords. The Vampire Lords are the eldest and greatest of their dark kind, standing above even vampire counts in terms of power and influence. A vampire who has reached the level of Vampire Lord is incredibly powerful in both his own abilities and his temporal domain. The world shakes at his will, and the bravest heroes tremble to hear his name. Only the best of the vampires reach this rank. It is not enough to simply control kingdoms or to have lived for centuries. The vampire must also be a true master of dealing death, of dominating minds, and of harnessing his strength to the utmost effect. The vampires have no gods. The vampire lords are close enough to suffice. A vampire lord is able to call upon a host of powers, the nature of which varies from vampire to vampire. Some can call forth creatures such as wolves and bats to assail the armies of the living, and sometimes they can even learn how to change into these forms. Others are able to mesmerize weak-willed mortals with barely a glance. If the vampire has a strong affinity for magic, then his necromantic abilities expand both naturally and through study. Despite these awe-inspiring powers, however, there is a terrible price to pay. As the decades become centuries, many vampires lose their minds, sliding inexorably into madness. Seafaring vampire lords are instead known as Vampire Fleet Admirals. And here are some of the most infamous vampire lords. Aborash, the first of the Blood Knights and the mightiest of vampires. Conrad von Karstein, a bloodthirsty and unstable vampire who inherited Vlad's rule. Luthor Harkon, the mad pirate lord of the Vampire Coast. Malobord, the bastard son of Luan Leoncoeur. Manfred von Karstein, the most cunning and manipulative of Vlad von Karstein's get. He took over Sylvania after Conrad died in battle. Merovech, the Mad Duke of Mousillon. Mundvard, the Cruel, a Necrarch member of the von Karsteins. Neferata, the first vampire and the founder of the Lahmian Cabal. The Red Duke, a mighty knight of Bretonnia who was turned by Aborash himself. Ushoran, the first of the devolved Ghoul Kings. Vlad von Karstein, the first and greatest Count of Sylvania. And at last, Vasoran, the first of the Necrarchs. Next, the Masters of Death itself, the Master Necromancers. Necromancers are amongst the most cursed of all those who practice the magical arts, for they have damned their souls and exchanged their humanity for the ability to raise the dead and command them to wage war upon the living. Such willingness to damn one's soul is often a sign of desperation, for at the heart of each necromancer's morbid obsession is the need to escape the inevitability of death and to subjugate and punish those who have persecuted him in the past, regardless of the cost. Once these men and women go upon this dark road, there is no going back. For although they may extend their lives beyond the mortal limit, death is still an inevitability, and the Death God shows little mercy for those who would transgress his will and deathly domain. It is usually men, rather than the longer-lived races, that delve into the study of necromancy. These few individuals are not necessarily evil to begin with. Some may desire knowledge for its own sake, others may seek immortality, or to prolong the life of a loved one. Regardless, something about their unnatural pursuit invariably turns them to a darker path. Perhaps it is the horror and revulsion their fellows feel for them, or perhaps the pulsing energy of dark magic that warps their minds. Either way, when men take to the path of necromancy, madness is just as much an inevitability as death itself. To learn the dark art, an aspirant must find either a necromancer or a vampire and become his apprentice. It is from this need to learn the dark arts that often drives necromancers to become servants of the vampire counts, hoping to learn firsthand from the masters of undeath themselves. However, such servitude often comes at a steep price, for once a vampire takes in an apprentice, they are bound to the vampire for all eternity. In order to avoid such a fate, some have gone the path of studying the forbidden lore by reading through unholy books. Seeking out books of forbidden lore has its own perils altogether. Many are copies of older texts from long forgotten times, and there is no guarantee that any of the rituals found in them are correctly transcribed. Some simply do not work at all, and others may go disastrously wrong. Even with all the danger, these individuals still persist to accomplish their goals. As a person follows the dark path of a necromancer, they become even more detached from their mortal roots, morbidly questing after the secrets of death. A necromancer who is deeply steeped in the lore of the dead stands on the threshold between worlds, neither wholly alive, nor one of the undead. Their body twisted with unholy power, their minds seared by the horrors they have witnessed. A necromancer often has more in common with their lurching, moaning minions than with the living they seek to slay. And they will rise from their graves to march upon the world of the living. Each and every mortal that falls will swell their numbers until only a world of darkness remains. Only then will the world know of the eternal order that lies within the peace of undeath. From the Grimoire Necronium, Chapter 12, from the Book of Vasoran. Now next a subclass and the true masters of necromancy, the aptly named Master Necromancers. The Master Necromancers are those few individuals whom have dedicated their entire existence to the learning and practicing of necromancy and dark magic, extending their lifespan beyond their mortal limits. These evil mages are truly powerful sorcerers that have the ability to conjure up an entire army of undead all by themselves. Ancient and malevolent beings, they have since lost all touch with their former humanity. And now a quote about the Masters of Necromancy. Drifting between the living and the dead, a Master Necromancer summons undead minions to fight enemies on his behalf. Here are some of the most infamous necromancers. Arcan the Black, the Leash Lord, Frederick van Haal, Har Ak-Iman, Heinrich Kemmler, the Leash Master, Kadon, Louis Cypher, Manfred von Carstein, ruler of all Sylvania, Melchior the Ancient, Mildeon, Nagash, first and greatest of the necromancers, Obald, the Bone Father, Pitre Fons, the Madman of Mousillon, Vlad von Carstein, Vasoran, first of the Necrarchs, Zacharias, the Ever-Living, the Dread King, and Helman Gorst, the chief necromancer of Manfred von Carstein. And at last, the final and most bloodthirsty and monstrous category of vampire lords, the Strigoi Ghoul Kings. The Strigoi Ghoul Kings were once proud and mighty vampires of the Strigoi bloodline that had previously ruled as masters of the ancient human civilization of Strigos and its ancient capital city of Murkane. However, ever since their downfall, these vampires have since been shunned and hunted down by other vampiric bloodlines and forced into a state of troglodyte existence. Since then, these Ghoul Kings have spent their days creeping through crypts and catacombs, awaiting the coming of night, where they would enact a dire vengeance at the head of a shambling undead army. The creation of the creature known by many as Ghoul Kings came about right after the fall of Strigos and the death of their vampire king, Ushoran. The downfall of Strigos came about when Ushoran's sister, Queen Neferata of the Lahmian bloodline, finally enacted her long-planned revenge to punish her younger brother for all the insults he had done to her over the centuries, manipulating vampires from the other bloodlines into her cause. Neferata caught the kingdom of Strigos between the armies of the undead and the hordes of greenskins that were beginning to invade the lands of the old world during the Time of Woes. With their master's death, the Strigoi vampires fled northward, where they hoped to find sanctuary from Vashanesh. However, he had no time for their perils, and fell upon his former brethren with a cold fury. After many similar bloody betrayals, the few remaining Strigoi vampires were forced to scatter themselves all across the old world in the hopes of evading persecution. Whenever they met vampires of different bloodlines, the Strigoi vampires had to hide from the wrath of their kin. From catacomb, haunted wood and moss-covered ruin, they would spy on the Lahmian and von Karstein vampires at the balls and banquets of the aristocracy. The nobility and wealth of their finely dressed kin reminded the Strigoi of what they had lost, and bitterness and envy started to gnaw at their minds. In their desolation, many of them lost their sanity completely and became solitary, pathetic parasites, wary of feeding on humans for fear of attracting the attention of witch hunters or, even worse, their own contemptuous kin. For this reason, they hid in graveyards, digging out recently buried corpses to drink their cold, fetid blood, and hiding during the day in the dank crypts near their feeding grounds. Their physical appearance soon came to reflect their miserable condition, and over the centuries, the remnants of the Strigoi turned into hunched and grotesque monstrosities. Packs of flesh-eating crypt ghouls are attracted to these dismal Strigoi and often form grotesque courts around them. Grave robbers and those who steal from the bodies of the fallen have learned well that they must practice their depraved crafts in the twilight and be home before nightfall. Under cover of darkness, different breeds of scavengers fall on these places of death. It is little wonder that the people of Sylvania refer to the Strigoi as the Ghoul Kings. Even if most of them have, to some degree, lost their minds during their long exile, the Ghoul Kings still possess many of the innate powers common to all vampires. They can tear out a victim's throat in the blink of an eye, and their authority over the undead and the myriad creatures of the night is still strong. The Ghoul Kings have not lost the power to raise the dead from their slumber and bind them to their will, but they do so in their own instinctual way. Their magic is less subtle than the forms of necromancy practiced by other vampires, but in the cut and thrust of combat, their savagery gives them a definite edge. At times, powerful Strigoi Ghoul Kings raise vast armies of the living dead around themselves and push south in a desperate attempt to recreate the kingdom they lost. So far, their advance has always been halted by war-mongering tribes of greenskins blocking the way to the Badlands, or by disciplined armies of the Tomb Kings that stride out from the desert as an act of revenge for the vampires that destroyed their once beautiful homeland. Yet across the old world, the minions of the Ghoul Kings have been sighted ever more frequently. Some say the ancient brethren of the Strigoi are uniting under one leader and massing great armies of degenerate beasts in their cavernous lairs. If this is true, no creature, living or dead, is truly safe from their wrath. And here is the list of the most notable Strigoi Ghoul Kings. First up, Ushoran, the first and greatest of his monstrous kind. Gashnag, ruler of his own petty border principality. Druthor, a Ghoul King who fought during the End Times. Straxos, the enemy of the famed Bretonnian knight Torin, the Wanderer. And Prince Ramtep spends most of his time sleeping under Miragliano, Besides his huge collection of treasured magic items, none of the grave robbers who disturb his lair ever leave again.